In the darkest corners of our prison systems, there are individuals so dangerous that the mere thought of their release can be a terrifying nightmare. These are not just ordinary criminals. They are harbingers of terror, ruthless masterminds, and remorseless predators. These are evil prisoners whose crimes were so brutal, so shocking, that society had no choice but to lock them away indefinitely. And as you learn their stories, you might find yourself silently hoping that the keys to their cells are never found. Charles Manson. One of the most terrifying figures in American criminal history. As the orchestrator of the infamous Manson family murders in 1969, Manson cultivated a cult-like following, manipulating his followers into committing heinous acts of violence, including the brutal slayings of actress Sharon Tate and several others. On the night of August 8, 1969, somewhere around Cielo Drive in Los Angeles, 4 intruders stormed into a random house, brutally killing everyone inside, as well as a teenager passing by. But the mastermind behind this bloodshed wasn't even present. Manson, the manipulative cult leader, orchestrated 9 horrifying murders, even though he claimed he never directly ordered a single killing. He had twisted the minds of his young followers, the so-called Manson family, leading them to commit atrocities beyond comprehension. Even after his conviction, his infamy only increased as his name was mixed up with pure evil. What's shocking is that Manson's reign of terror was not merely a series of murders. It was a dark reflection on societal unrest of the 1960s counterculture. His ideology, rooted in chaos, was fueled by a toxic mix of music, drugs, and charismatic leadership. After his arrest in 1971, Manson's followers stole 140 guns, planning to hijack a plane. Their goal was to kill passengers one by one until their cult leader, Charles Manson, was released. Thankfully, they were caught before this horrifying plan could be realized. Just a few years later, in 1979, Lynette "Squeaky" Fromm, Manson's most devoted disciple, took their terror to a new level. She aimed a gun at President Gerald Ford in broad daylight just 2 feet away. It jammed. Her attempt to murder the president was foiled by seconds. These terrifying events only added to the legend of Manson. But it was the Tate LaBianca murders of 1969 that truly made him America's ultimate boogeyman. Ted Bundy. Operating in the 1970s, this killer was responsible for the brutal murders of at least 30 young women across multiple states, employing a deceptive facade that allowed him to lure his victims with ease. His intelligence and good looks masked a dark, predatory nature that made him a master manipulator, drawing in both the victims and society at large. Bundy's heinous acts were marked by a sadistic approach that escalated in brutality. He would often return to the scenes of his crimes, reliving the horrors he inflicted, leaving behind a trail of devastated families and shattered communities. At one point, he declared himself the most cold-hearted son of a bitch you'll ever meet, and his horrific crimes proved him right. In the spring of summer of 1974, many young women in the Pacific Northwest vanished from college campuses across Washington and Oregon. In just 6 months, 6 women were abducted, leaving law enforcement desperate and communities on edge. The situation got out of hand when Janice Ott and Denise Nosland disappeared from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish State Park in broad daylight. But this bold move gave investigators their first real clue. Several women recalled a charming man with his arm in a sling trying to lure them to his car, a brown Volkswagen Beetle. When the description went public, 4 people identified the man as Ted Bundy. Yet despite these tips coming from his ex-girlfriend, a close friend, a co-worker, and a psychology professor, Bundy was dismissed. How could a clean-cut law student with no criminal record be a killer? His ability to manipulate and deceive allowed him to continue his reign of terror, claiming at least 30 victims across 7 states. He was, as his lawyer later put it, the very definition of heartless evil. His trial captivated the country, and even from behind bars, he made attempts to manipulate the media and the public. But in 1989, when Bundy was finally executed, a collective sigh of relief swept across America, ending a nightmare that haunted the country for years. Richard Ramirez, infamously known as the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez terrorized Southern California in the mid-1980s, leaving a horrifying mark on the collective consciousness. His reign of terror was characterized by a series of brutal home invasions, sexual assaults, and murders that struck fear into the hearts of many. Ramirez, driven by a dark combination of satanic beliefs and sadism, targeted men, women, and children indiscriminately, often using a variety of weapons to inflict maximum pain. The Night Stalker's attacks were particularly scary. He would often enter homes through unlocked doors and windows, bringing a sense of dread through neighborhoods. His ability to avoid being caught only increased the terror as police struggled to connect the dots of his gruesome attacks. On August 31st, 1985, Ramirez walked into a Los Angeles convenience store, unaware his face was now plastered on every newspaper. When he saw himself on the front page, he bolted in terror. By then, he was the prime suspect in a year-long killing spree that terrorized California. The public had his face memorized, and as he fled, bystanders pointed him out. A desperate chase followed, 7 police cars, a helicopter overhead, but it wasn't the police who caught him. Enraged locals, furious at his horrific crimes, beat him mercilessly, even one wielding a metal pipe. By the time the police arrived, Ramirez was grateful to be arrested. Even though he died in prison in 2013, the fear he spread haunted California for years to come. John Wayne Gacy, a name that strikes terror into the hearts of those familiar with his heinous acts, was a master of deception. By day, he was a community figure, known for his work as a successful contractor and local Democratic Party volunteer while performing as Pogo the Clown. But by night, he transformed into a monster, luring young boys to his home in Chicago under the guise of offering them work or a safe place to stay. Gacy's reign of terror in the 1970s claimed the lives of at least 33 young men and boys, many of whom he sexually assaulted and murdered. He buried many of his victims in the crawlspace of his home, creating a grim graveyard that would later shock the nation when discovered. On January 2nd, 1972, 16-year-old Timothy McCoy, trying to be kind, made breakfast for Gacy. Unknowingly holding a knife, he woke Gacy, who mistook the gesture for a threat and stabbed McCoy in the chest, killing him instantly. He buried the body in his crawlspace, covering the grave with concrete. That first murder gave Gacy an ultimate thrill he would chase for years. Over the next 6 years, dozens more would follow. His arrest in 1978 was very shocking. Convicted and sentenced to death, he was always remembered as the clown no one wants to know. Dennis Rader, BTK Killer. The moniker BTK stands for Bind, Torture, and Kill. Operating undetected for over 30 years, Rader earned his nickname as a result of his dangerous actions. He planned his gruesome crimes, preying on vulnerable individuals with a life seemingly normal. Working as a compliance officer and active in his church, he skillfully masked his double life, luring victims into a false sense of security. On January 15th, 1974, he broke into the Otero family home and murdered 4 members, Joseph and Julie Otero, and 2 of their children, Josephine and Joseph Jr., died by strangulation. After murdering them, he took from the house a couple of items, a radio and a watch. Evidence showed that he left at the crime scene his semen. According to his own confessions, BTK thought that he would be caught. To his surprise, that didn't happen. He even said that he left something behind and returned to get it, and that's when he thought he would be arrested. Meanwhile, his reign of terror began in 1974 and continued until his arrest in 2005, when he was finally unmasked through his own hubris. He taunted authorities and the media with letters detailing his heinous acts. After serving 10 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, Dennis Rader embodies the very essence of evil. David Berkowitz, Son of Sam. Known as the Son of Sam, David Berkowitz unleashed terror on the streets of New York, randomly shooting people in their cars. Claiming he was driven by messages from a demon-possessed dog, Berkowitz stalked the Bronx and Queens, armed with a revolver, killing 6 and wounding 7 more. His letters to the police and his brutal attacks plunged New York City into a state of fear, sparking one of the largest manhunts in history. David's horrific behavior began in 1976 and lasted for a year. What made his crimes even more dark was his letters to the press, taunting authorities and expressing his twisted motivations. Berkowitz's attacks were characterized by their randomness, creating an atmosphere of paranoia that gripped the city. He targeted young couples, shooting them in their parked cars, and his unpredictable nature left the public in a constant state of dread. In 1977, Berkowitz was finally apprehended, confessing to the murders with a disturbing calmness. In the end, he was given multiple life sentences, never to be released again. Gary Ridgway. Known as the Green River Killer, Gary is one of America's most notorious serial killers. Active in the 1980s and early 1990s, he preyed on vulnerable women in Washington state, claiming at least 49 victims. Usually, he would lure women into his vehicle, often under the guise of providing help, before brutally murdering them and disposing of their bodies in the Green River. What makes Ridgway particularly terrifying is not just the number of his victims, but the calculated nature of his crimes. He often returned to the sites of his victims' remains, showcasing a disturbing level of detachment and control. Cold and calculating, Ridgway even described the brutal efficiency of performing necrophilia on victims to avoid killing again. Despite his horrifying crimes, he was apprehended and later confessed to the murders, revealing the dark depths of his psyche. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without parole, but the thought of his potential release always never goes well. Pedro Alonzo Lopez. Known as the Monster of the Andes, Lopez is one of the most horrifying figures in the history of crime. Between the late 1960s and early 1970s, he started terrorizing Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru, claiming the lives of others. From 1969 to 1980, Colombian serial killer Pedro Lopez raped and murdered up to 300 children, and no one knows where he is today. His monstrous actions were driven by an insatiable lust for violence, making him one of the most dangerous serial killers in history. He lured his victims with the promise of a better life or simple kindness, only to unleash unspeakable horrors upon them. In 1980, after Lopez was captured, he spoke of killing in a ritualistic manner, sometimes returning to the sites of his crimes, relishing in the horror he had wrought. After being imprisoned in Ecuador, he was controversially released in 1994 due to a lack of evidence, act that left many in disbelief and fear. Today, the thought of Pedro Alonzo Lopez roaming free is a nightmare scenario that society should fervently pray never comes to fruition. Andre Chikatilo. Infamously known as the Butcher of Rostov, Chikatilo is known for preying on innocent women and children. His gruesome acts left a trail of 52 confirmed victims, although he claimed that the true number could be far higher. His capture in 1990 came after a lengthy investigation that was marred by police blunders and his inability to evade capture for years. Once apprehended, he displayed a disturbing lack of remorse, explaining his crimes with a chilling detachment that revealed the depths of his depravity. The trial that followed was a grotesque spectacle, shining a light on the horrors he inflicted. Convicted and sentenced to death in 1994, Chikatilo's legacy is one of unimaginable evil. The thought of him ever being released is a nightmare that society cannot afford to entertain. Eileen Warus. Eileen Warus, often labeled as America's first female serial killer, remains a very dark figure in true crime history. From 1989 to 1990, Warus claimed the lives of 7 men in Florida, asserting that her acts were committed in self-defense against violent sexual assaults. However, the brutality of her crimes paints a chilling portrait of a woman driven to violence by a tumultuous life marked by abuse and neglect. Growing up in a broken home, Warus endured a childhood rife with trauma, which forged a complex relationship with violence and survival. After years of living on the fringes of society, her descent into murder was both shocking and tragic, making her a subject of fascination and horror. Warus's trial revealed a woman struggling with her demons, yet her cold confessions and lack of genuine remorse left many questioning the depths of her evil. Bram Kroll. Infamously known as the Ruhr Carnival, Kroll is one of Germany's most notorious serial killers, embodying the sheer terror that lingers in the shadows. Between 1955 and 1976, Kroll preyed on innocent victims, luring them into his home before committing unspeakable acts of violence. His gruesome modus operandi involved not only murder but also cannibalism, as he confessed to cooking and consuming parts of his victims, a reality that scared the whole country. Kroll's dark legacy began in a modest home in the Ruhr area, where he led a seemingly mundane life as a factory worker. Yet behind closed doors, he transformed into a monster, driven by an insatiable appetite for violence and flesh. The chilling details of his crimes emerged after his arrest in 1976, revealing the depths of his depravity. He was ultimately convicted for the murders of at least 14 individuals, although many believe the true number may be much higher. Imprisoned for life, it is so easy to see that Kroll's evils are simply too monstrous for him to be set free. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Known infamously as the Moors murderers, this twisted pair committed heinous crimes that would forever haunt the United States. Their victims, 5 children, aged between 10 and 17, were not only abducted, but subjected to unimaginable torture and murder. Their bodies buried on the desolate moors of Saddleworth. Brady, a man whose insatiable thirst for power and control led him to become one of the UK's most infamous criminals, was the architect of their horrors. Hindley, drawn into the malevolent web, became complicit in the atrocities, demonstrating the harrowing depths of evil that can arise from twisted devotion. Their capture and subsequent trial revealed a grotesque portrait of psychological manipulation and brutality. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment, yet their dark legacy continues to instill fear. Ultimately, the very fear of Brady and Hindley ever being released is unthinkable.